I've got where in the Genesis where the farm boys come from, it's a very prude society as far as sex goes. It's arranged marriages. There is no nudity. There is no, lewdness anywhere. It's a closed society. And so both of the boys, when they go out and because they go in different directions and they meet the rest of the world that isn't like that, one, the world thinks they're weird, and two, they're shocked and appalled by some of the things that they encounter as they go out into that world because it is but both of them do it even though they go completely different directions on completely different continents. It doesn't matter. They still have that same cultural upbringing, and so that thread, that's their core, their norms, their symbolism that they're taking with them into these other cultures, and you get that clash between the two.
Releasing your inner dragon.
All right, Murray, we're stepping back into another aspect of your domain, cultures. So if you had to say, what are the top three things that a writer really needs to flesh out before they start writing? And we're talking about fantasy worlds here or sci-fi worlds, where you're not just 2025 New York, where your audience is going to pretty much know what's going on. What are the three things that you think are vital to understand about the culture, and why?
So I think you have to understand what I call your culture's vibe, your culture's core kind of principles that they hang their hat on, how they feel about these principles, and I'll take you through them. Then I think you really need to understand how the fantastical elements affect your culture, like how magic affects your culture, how fantasy elements affect your culture, and so on. And then I think you really want to understand your cultural norms, because your norms, the actual folkways and the taboos and the laws and so on of your culture will determine the driving forces of your character. If your culture has a deep taboo on using magic and your character is exposed to magic, that changes their approaches. It drives the story, it drives character growth, it drives pretty much everything about the culture.
Yeah. The funny thing is that most people would answer that, with like, oh, you need to know your religion, you need to know your whatever. And I love your answers because every one of them are about they are about understanding the world and the culture, but they're about understanding the motivation of the character. And that's all that matters. We need to understand how our characters are going to react, how our characters, because our characters are not us, they are them. And so every one of your answers literally went down that path of understand this and you'll understand how the character thinks, understand this and you'll understand how the character thinks, understand this and understand how the character thinks. So yeah, 100%. And that really does make a huge impact on the story.
Yeah. I think people overestimate the value of defining your religions and so on up front. It is far more important to understand the feel of your culture and the kind of people who come out of that culture than it is, because the religion is just part of what formalizes the culture, right? Religion is an identity of sorts. You say, I am a, fill in the blank here, Buddhist, Christian, etc., etc. It's an identity. It doesn't, now, of course, in a fantasy world, you might have actual gods and so on, but then that's part of your fantastical elements. And you will, as part of defining how the fantastical elements influence the culture, you'll define how those gods affect the culture.
Yeah. So I'm a new writer. I've got this burr in my saddle that I'm going to write a fantasy book. I've read a lot of fantasy. I'm a fantasy fan. I've listened to Releasing Your Inner Dragon religiously, and I've subscribed. I've liked every video. I've commented a few times because I'm, really good at my side of this relationship.
Hmm.
And I've listened and I've heard you guys say, don't just immediately start writing. Like you're just going to write yourself in a hole. You need to think about some things. You may not be a plotter, like Drake is. You may not be a pantser like Maria is, but you got to figure something out so you have some type of ground, especially in something like fantasy or sci-fi, where you're going to have a lot of fantastical elements. So where do I begin? Where would I start thinking about, how am I going to go about, like, because when you think about world building, if you actually think about world building, it becomes incredibly overwhelming. Not only politics and religion and society and taboos and all this stuff, but like literally gravity. How gravity works. How does physics work? How does food work? How does, like, you literally have to be God and create an entire freaking universe. Like, where do I start?
So I have great news for you, like fantastic news, because I have a model. So, and I will walk you through that model. But not only will I walk you through that model, you can actually download this, which is my rough beta draft, for free, for gratis, for nothing, on my Ko-fi page. So I will leave a link to that as well down below. And eventually this model will be part of a world building book that will guide the reader from zero to hero in world building. Okay,
And
so
that's gonna be out sometime middle of next year.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not, no hard release date here, but and
No,
then I understand you're also going to be making a video series out of it, a class series, or at least that's what
yes,
you have in mind.
yes, I do, for Drake U, so which will
Yay.
be available on that platform. Okay, so this is the core of the model. Now, or this is the model, right? So you start here at the core. Don't worry about the lines for now. We'll talk about them later. The core of the model is basically your cultural ideology, your cultural vibes, all right? And you have basically four pillars that have, or four scaled variables, right? That you give your culture a score on. So, and they are hierarchy versus egalitarianism. So how hierarchical is your culture? Are they like feudal Europe with very strict hierarchies, or like India with a very strong caste system? Or is it more kind of free and, everybody's more or less seen as equal? Like, you know, and then collectivism versus individualism. People sometimes mistake this. They go like it's communism or whatever. No, this is about what you prioritize. Do you prioritize the group over the individual or the individual over the group? And remember,
Yeah,
these are scores out of 10 on the one side and 1 on the other. Very few cultures are going to be 10 or 1. Most of them fall somewhere on the sliding scale.
yeah. So you're talking about, you know, do I care about just myself and maybe my immediate family,
Yeah,
or do I care about myself and my immediate family, but I also care, equally or almost equally with the society that I come from? My people are important to
yeah,
me, not
yeah.
just my kids and my wife and me.
And also, like, do you care about your neighbors? Is it a thing in your community to help out, the elderly who are living in the house next door, even though you're not related to them? That kind of thing. It's
Yeah.
about, where does the priority in the culture lie? The individual and its and their needs, or the um community and their needs.
Yeah. A great example of that right here in the United States. I'm a Southern boy. So we knew everybody, all your neighbors. You move into a new neighborhood, people come, like, while you're unloading and moving into the house, people are coming over and introducing themselves. And maybe they bring something, maybe they don't, that just depends. I move in here to Vegas, and it's like a ghost town. I mean, it's a fully populated neighborhood. Every house has people, but as they're driving up, they push the button to raise their garage door. They drive into the garage, and as they're still pulling into the garage door is already lowering down. So, like, I tried, when I was unloading the truck and everything, my neighbor on the right, was out, and I went over and was like, "Hey, I'm your new neighbor, blah blah." And he's like, "Oh, my name is Eric. Nice to meet you." Literally, last time I ever spoke to him. And then the next day, my neighbor on the left was out, and so I went over and I was like, "Hey, I'm Drake. I'm your new neighbor." And he's like, "Oh, my name is Eric." And I was like, "Oh, that's funny. I'm surrounded by Erics." And he was like, "What?" I'm like, "The dude that lives next to me is named Eric, just like you." And both of them had lived in this neighborhood for like 7 years, and they had never met each other. 2 houses away. And now I'm the same way. Like, I don't know any of my neighbors because those two guys have moved, and literally I know nobody. I know nobody and I don't care.
Yep.
So it's changed my society to much more from a collectivism to an individualism, just from the
Yeah.
society.
It also depends, like, on a cultural kind of root level. So here in Finland, like, we very rarely would interact with our neighbors, but when you're doing snow work, you would extend your snow work to include your neighbors if they're like elderly or struggling, whatever, because it is just part of the community, even if you're not as friendly. But it's, yeah, basically it's about that balance between collectivism versus individualism. Um, then free versus ordered is about how much rules and regulations exist in your society and how much kind of freedom exists in your society, right? So, and remember, like, again, here, it's not a huge political thing. It's about, is your society highly regulated? Does it have a lot of laws? Is it like less regulated and people must, look after their own safety? They must look after their own health. They must, like, you understand what I'm saying? Like, it is a regulatory or non-regulatory.
And I would have to believe that that's also fairly tied to whether it's a hierarchy or an egalitarianism
So
society.
yes, to some extent.
Right.
All right. So you can have a hierarchy that is reasonably free, depending on what your hierarchy is structured around, right? Let's say your hierarchy is structured around who can cast the most powerful fireballs, right? And that's who determines who makes group decisions. Okay. But you are free to call the guy who can cast the biggest fireballs a poo-poo head, and he won't do anything to you unless you break the regulations of the town, right? But he won't be your friend either. So,
Unless he's into that kind of thing.
unless he's into that kind of thing. But, and so it kind of, it depends a little bit, but mostly yes. More hierarchical societies tend to be more ordered. But this is fantasy. You can have all kinds of weird combinations that we wouldn't necessarily see in our world. And then traditional versus progressive. Again, this is not progressive in the sense that it's used in politics. It means change embracing. Societies that are more focused on maintaining their core than societies who progress, who change, who embrace change.
So I think we've skipped a definition that I do think is important that we
Yeah.
take a step back just to define. And my story about just in the United States, two different places, two different states here in the United States, and the difference. Remember, we are talking cultures here. So cultures can be one village, cultures could be an entire kingdom. Rarely is a culture world dominating, and that's what so many, we call that the trope of hats,
Yes.
where you give, Star Trek was lousy at this. It's like, we're going to go to a planet. Everyone on that planet hates broccoli.
Yes.
There's no broccoli is a sin on this planet for the entire planet. There's no variation. And it's like, yeah, no. So, I mean, like, even neighborhoods within cities. So Mockley and in Genesis, I have different neighborhoods of it, and they have their own cultures. Now, they're very similar to each other because they're all under the same laws and under the same
Right.
government and everything like that. But they have differences between, even neighborhoods within this city. And so I think it's important to define that to make sure that everybody understands. We're not talking about you're going to create this one time for your entire fantasy world. This is something to think about depending on, when I'm teaching world building, I talk about the the reach of government is the reach of their ability to actually enforce things. So, if it's like Jordan's Wheel of Time pops to mind with Edmonds Field, the village that we start in. It is 100 miles from nowhere. They don't even realize they're a part of a kingdom. So, because no one from the kingdom has even showed up to this place in like 150 years. So, like, when they're told, yeah, you're a part of this kingdom, they're like, no, we're not. What are you talking about? So, because the kingdom is not powerful enough to extend its reach out there to actually enforce anything. So these people have kind of become an island out there on their own with their own government, their own everything, their own culture, the whole 9 yards.
So in the book, where I'm explaining this, I also say, like, it is important to understand that subcultures exist. So within a given larger culture, so within a kingdom culture, you could very well have a village culture that has different traditions. Then what you do is you take the same model and you indicate which parts of the culture is inherited straight through onto the levels and where it varies because of the subculture.
Yeah.
So that, you have your reuse from the containing culture, and then you've got your subculture inside it. And your subcultures are very often also determined by your identities over here, these green lines. So, for example, if you have, say, gender divides culturally, there could be a culture for men, a culture for women, like with some variation in things like their hierarchy, their even laws, depending on how your culture
Which
is
exists
structured.
here on Earth.
As
We
it is
have
here on Earth. Yeah.
we have Jewish communities. We have, whatever. You'll have a religious community where almost everyone within that community is that religion. They're still a part of the bigger whole, but they have their own individual traditions as well.
Exactly. The same with race. So these are all subcultures that inherit from the parent culture, but have certain specific changes that they make within the structures. Okay, so that's the core of your culture, right? So that's your vibes, or your, like, how your culture feels, your cultural ideology. Now, the next step up from that is norms. Okay. And norms is a fascinating part of this whole conversation. So norms is basically divided into three aspects: folkways, which are like unwritten rules, and then mores, which are like moral things that sometimes are laws and sometimes not, and taboos, which are almost always laws. Okay. So the difference is, for example, folkways. Have you ever walked into an elevator and turned your back on the door? What,
No,
Have you ever
no,
gone to an elevator and stood at the back with your back towards the door?
no.
It's a folkway.
Right.
It's a folkway. Like, the way that you look when you cross the road is a folkway. Yes, of course, it's driven by our cars and so on, but it's a folkway.
Yeah.
Right.
My favorite thing to do on an elevator is to get on an elevator with a bunch of people and just go and then never actually finish it. It will literally drive everyone mad.
My favorite thing to do on an elevator, if I'm feeling particularly that way inclined, is to, as the elevator doors close behind me, say, "I gathered you all here today."
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
That's
so
I got a friend who does that a lot.
so
Not that you're not a
this,
friend, but I'm just saying.
yeah.
A friend here.
And so yeah, folkways are also the way we greet people. You shake somebody's hand, you bow, all of those things are folkways.
You shake with your right hand, you shake with your left hand.
Yeah.
There's no
And
laws.
yeah. And it's, in Dune, when the desert, the Fremen spit as a sign of respect, that's a folkway. Right. So it's basically things that make it easier to get along in the culture.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
obey the folkways, it's easier because everybody understands. There's this kind
Right.
of mutual unwritten understanding.
Right. And when you start mixing that in, especially if you're doing fantasy like us and you start mixing that with history, you can actually have things that used to be laws that become folkways. So, like in Genesis, the way men greet each other is, and technically it should be everybody, but now because of the distance in time, it's just the men. But they hold their right palm up as they're approaching, and then
Yeah.
they actually shake hands, but they actually hold their palm up, and that was a law back in the day, actually for everybody, for men and women. It was the law that you had to do that, and there was a reason for it because of the world.
Mm.
But as 1,500 years have passed, that law has gone away because of things. And now no one even knows why they do it, except for a very few people that understand why that was very important to have a law of that. But the rest of the world don't. But everyone still does it because it's the thing to do.
So you remind me of Adrian Tchaikovsky also did that, but he had two different cultures, right? So the wasp culture can shoot fire from their hands, like little electric stings. And because of that, in the wasp culture, it is threatening to hold up open palms. And it is a sign of peace to close your fists. And everybody else in the world is obviously the other way around, right? Because a
Right.
closed fist kind of universally is the sign for
Right.
I'm a throw hands now.
Yeah. Well, I think it's
um,
funny. I think it's chimpanzees, maybe,
hmm,
um, that if you smile and show teeth, that's a very aggressive,
yeah.
nasty thing. So they're like, don't smile at the monkeys.
Yeah, but that's it exactly. It's a very culturally different thing because of this wasp ability, the
Yeah.
wasp pendant ability.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
I love
that's
thinking about that when I'm working on my cultures.
it is a very, very good way to distinguish cultures from each other, is to have
Hmm.
slightly different folkways. It's also something you can show very effectively in your cultural world building. And it shows like little details of your culture that you would not be able to bring to bear otherwise. Then you have the mores, which are basically your moral backbone. So examples of mores, is things like respecting property rights. Yeah. Which, is like here up here in the Nordics, for example, we have what is called a right to roam. Okay.
Hmm.
I can walk on any land, including private land, and gather berries, mushrooms, and ice fish without a license and without it being considered theft. But that is a Nordic thing. Maybe Northern European. I'm not quite sure about Germany, but it's very much here in the Nordic. It is part of our cultural heritage. It's part of our understanding with the land. All of that. That is not something I would ever try in America. I think I'd get shot. So those are
Well, it depends.
yeah.
So, when I was really young, I was living in West Virginia.
Hmm.
And West Virginia, you just walked. You just walked in a straight line and you would cross over whatever. It didn't really matter. And, a lot of blackberries, a lot of rhubarb, a lot of different things that we would collect, chestnuts and stuff like that. And you just collect them and eat them and just do your thing. You can't do that in Vegas because every single house has a 6 foot wall around it. And
Yeah,
so there's just no way to
exactly.
get past those.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really does depend on the culture. It's not necessarily an American thing because there are different parts of America that are just have very different cultures, especially in something like that, or just walking across your property. No one cared,
Mm.
in West Virginia. It just was a thing. You just no, there was no, yes, you own this property, but if somebody walks through your property, unless it's, obviously there's still self-preservation, but if it's a couple kids, no one's gonna care. No one's gonna be like, get off my lawn.
And then, I mean, of course, in morality, there's always like questions around marriage and so on. Like in Sangwil, I've got my threesome marriage. You can have marriages that are based on other things than fidelity. There's all kinds of like things that you can build in here around the kind of what is considered moral. Um, no, then it's also important to remember that norms or mores aren't necessarily laws. Let's say, for example, lying, right? Lying isn't against the law, yeah, in most places, but it's against the law if you are under oath in a court.
Mhm.
So there's sometimes things that are considered morally wrong in some cases, but they're not illegal per se, which is
Unless certain stipulations are happening.
yeah, unless there's certain specific circumstances. So it's always also interesting to draw those lines. And then the last one of your norms is taboos. Okay. So taboos are big. They're things like cannibalism. I met very few cultures. There's a couple on earth that are okay with cannibalism, you know, but like, and for most people, this is like a gig that they draw a hard line at.
Human, the other white meat.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, things, if you think of things like incest or desecration of sacred sites, or, you know, in Westeros, with George R.R. Martin, right? Kinslaying is seen as this grievous sin. You know, so there's a lot of that kind of like taboos, which then play deeply into, and taboos are a great way to drive story, because your character encountering a taboo is a shocking thing to them.
Yeah.
Um,
So one correction. So one of the people in our chat room has a hardcore scientific background. And
yes.
so she said human smiles come from the ape fear face, which means don't attack me. I'm submissive. So
Okay.
just going to throw that because I make stuff up for a living. Just the way it is. And on that note, if you would like to join us while we're recording Releasing Your Dragons, it's actually very simple and free. You just go to writersroom.us, join the free section of it. You don't get all the benefits of the Writers Room. You know, if you want to work with me and Marie on a weekly basis and get my writing workshops, my writing classes, all of those things, you do have to become a member. But if you just join the free year, you do get a ton of different things that you can participate in. And one of them is joining us here, and you can chat live while we're actually doing the recording.
Now, so those two, your core and your norms, you've got to have for every culture. Yeah, you cannot skip them. All right. But then from there on, it depends. It depends on how much you need to define this culture. Does a main character come from this culture? Because if so, you probably want to do all the layers. But if it's like a side culture or whatever, do the core and do maybe some of the expressions and so on and leave it at that. You don't need more than that. You need just the basic concepts. But your next step up, culturally speaking, is symbols. Now, symbols includes your linguistic symbolism, right? So things like idioms, expressions, way of talking, all of that is part of your symbolism layer. It is your physical symbols, like, you know, in Vegas, you have the Knights as a hockey team. And, you know, so having a ball cap with the Knights on in Vegas is a sign of cultural symbolism there.
Man, here it's weird that we're a hockey town since we live in the desert, but every 2 out of 3 cars will have a Knights logo on the back.
Yeah.
Like it's insane how much of a hockey town this town has become. But yeah, that's a symbol. That's it, and it brings unity. Like I have no idea the person in that car, but they like, and I'm the same way with Steelers, and you don't see quite as many Steelers, but Steelers is the #1 football team in the United States as far as fan base is concerned. And so like you will walk through a Walmart and see someone in a Steelers hat, shirt, whatever, and they don't know you're a Steelers fan because you're not wearing anything, but I do it often. Other people do it to me when I'm wearing a Steelers something. You'll just be walking by a stranger and they'll go Steelers. And that's it. It's just go Steelers and nothing else. But it's just that we're kin. You know, it could be a person of a different race, different gender, doesn't matter. We have a kinship now in this millisecond that we're passing each other in a Walmart shopping aisle. And that's it. That symbolism brings us together. We could literally, if we actually got to know each other, hate each other's guts or become best friends. Doesn't matter about any of that. It just matters about we have that symbol that binds us together instantly.
And even the words you use there, like I don't know what team the Steelers are. I assume they're a football team in America. That
They are.
symbol, that word, which is symbolic of this football team, means nothing to me because I'm not part of the culture.
Right. Right.
um, and
And it's
and
not steel, EAL. It's
yeah.
steel as in metal because it's the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is the metal town. So
Mm.
they actually use the symbol for steel, or the union or whatever. They actually asked for permission and they used that. That was back like in the 30s or something. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
it it is something that's culturally relevant, but you're from Finland, so
Yeah. Like
and it also
we have
depends on.
symbols here, like our lion with his, sword through the face. That comes from Sweden, and anyway, it's a long story. He's standing on a Russian saber because, down with the Russia. It's a long story.
But you took it through the forehead.
The
That's
lion, the lion looks like he's eating flowers. He looks like he's eating flowers and stabbing himself in the face.
yeah, but it means something to people, and also the closer you get, like one of the big reasons why we are Steelers fans is we moved to Pittsburgh,
Mm.
and you just can't. There's a couple cities in this town that when you live in it, it is so football heavy. We have the Raiders here. And you do see a lot of Raiders symbolism around. There's T-shirts and stuff like that. But I don't, I don't know if anybody's like a diehard. Well, it's funny because the Steelers played here a couple weeks ago. It was a Steelers home game. The stand was packed with Steelers fans, and then there was some Raider fans too. But it literally was a Steelers home game. There were way more Steelers fans than Raiders fans.
Yeah.
So, you know, but the closer you get, and so that's the thing. I mean, we're talking about football here, but this all matters. This is all the same thing where we're talking about. Notice what we just went down, and we're talking about these different symbols and different things, but it actually makes us feel real. It makes, the fact that we can talk about this stuff, it makes, all of this stuff feel like, oh yeah, there's a culture that has a history that has a, you might not know where the Steelers logo came from or the Finnish coat of arms comes from, but it screams history. And so, I mean, it's like even dumb things. Like one of the things that I do, and I've talked about this before, I create a ton of festivals for my fantasy worlds. I almost never flesh them out. Almost never. I mean, the short story that the novella that I'm working on right now, he's walking through and I just describe a bunch of, paraphernalia that's up, some ropes and some decorations and stuff like that. And he thinks, or, in the narration, it says a remnants of the festival of the silver tides. I literally made that up when I wrote the line. Like, I have no idea what's going on. It doesn't matter to me, but it makes the world feel real and feel like it has a history and feel old. Now, if I ever run the story during the time of the Festival of the Silver Tides, I will figure out what that is. But it happened the day before the story. So it's over. I don't need to worry about why they have it. What is the symbolism of it? What's the cultural relevance of it? What's the history of it? I don't need any of that.
But it's also like that is not the only thing that you do that includes symbolism. Like you develop the way that those sailor people speak.
Oh yeah.
That is symbolic of their culture. It is the
Yeah.
way that they use words, and words are basically just symbols, right? Words
Yeah.
it's a symbolic utterance that means a connotation that we agree it means this thing or that thing or the other thing, or in English's case, 50 million things, because
Yeah. And then until Gen Z comes around, and then they're just speaking a foreign language now.
Yeah, but
It could
not
be that I'm
really.
just old. It could be that I'm
Yeah.
just old.
The thing is, like, again, that's an identity, right? This
Yeah.
generational thing in the United States is very much an identity. The boomer
Yeah.
identity, the
The
Gen X.
boomers had it with the hippie culture and,
Yeah.
daddy-o and all those things that we don't say anymore. Mine, the Gen X we had our own sayings that the generations before us didn't have and the generations
Yeah.
after don't use. And yeah, and again, it's all for why this is important for us as a writer to really think about is because it's all where kind of the identities of the people come from. You are shaped by this. And if I'm going to be running another character, I don't want them to be me. I want them to be them. And especially if they're coming from a completely foreign world, universe, dimension, whatever. Where's my fantasy worlds at? Who knows? It's definitely not here. There's no planet, in the Milky Way galaxy that my story's taken place on. It's not in this universe at all. So how would those characters be me? Like, why
Yeah.
would they think like me? Why would they act like me? Why would they talk like me? And so all of these things that we're talking about here, our producer sent us, as always, the topic and different research things, and every single one of them went into all the stuff that we're not talking about. And we didn't
If you need
plan
help
this ahead
building
of
a
time.
religion, I've got a whole series on religion. If you need
Right.
help, like all of these things, I've got details on. Those things don't matter. I mean, they matter.
It matters.
Obviously, they matter a lot if you're part of the culture, if it's part of your story, and so on. But what you need to understand about a culture is its heart, so that
Yes.
you understand how it shaped your character.
Yes. And all your characters, your secondary, your tertiary characters, everybody, they're all going to have threads that run through them, and they're all going to. So, I've got in the Genesis where the farm boys come from, it's a very prude society as far as sex goes. It's arranged marriages. There is no nudity. There is no, lewdness anywhere. It's a closed society. And so both of the boys, when they go out and because they go in different directions and they meet the rest of the world that isn't like that, one, the world thinks they're weird, and two, they're shocked and appalled by some of the things that they encounter as they go out into that world, because it is, but both of them do it, even though they go completely different directions on completely different continents. It doesn't matter. They still have that same cultural upbringing. And so that thread, that's their core, their norms, their symbolism that they're taking with them into these other cultures. And you get that clash between the two.
And that's exactly the point with the symbolism, is how important it is to give it that feel of the culture. It resides in its symbolism because that is what you can show the reader. Okay. So the next step up from that is your kinship. So kinship is a funny thing, because people think that, it's just about who you count as kin. And yes, sure. But there are different family structures. So this is a blank kinship diagram, all right? And basically, you start here. This is the character that you are defining kinship according. So this would be like your actual main character, okay? The first question is, what do they call their brother? What do they call their sister? Okay? There are cultures that would not distinguish between a brother and a sister. They would call both sibling. Okay? There are cultures where everybody on the male side would be brother in the generation of the family, and everybody on the female side would be sister. Right? It wouldn't be like divided into cousins and so on. Then you go up a level. What do they call their mother and their father versus their aunts and their uncles? In Swedish, you have a different word for your aunt on your father's side than from your aunt on your mother's side. The same the same for your uncle. The same for your grandparents. In English, you don't have that. In some cultures, everybody on this layer is mother and father. The Hawaiian culture, for example, everybody here is cousin, everybody here is mother and father, or uncle and aunt.
And just to take it a step further, we are so loose with aunt and uncle. There are a mass percentage of the American population that calls someone an aunt or calls someone an uncle that literally is not even related to them.
Yep.
My wife, to her best friend's kids, is, Aunt Joy, and that's what they call her. But we're not even related. They have no blood kinship whatsoever.
Yeah.
So, but that is that cultural thing where we are so close as friends that her children, see them, and our children have it with other people as well, that they see them as family and they're treated as family.
So the main purpose of this kind of kinship diagram is to determine who is responsible for whom.
Mm-hmm.
And who, so like if you're in the current generational layer, who has authority over you and to what extent? And if you're in the layer above, what is your authority to the layer below, and so on. There's that kind of definition. And also then in terms of like inheritance and goods and, the wealth within the family.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that's kinship. And it basically defines how your culture sees family. Then the step up from kinship is hierarchy. Like what kind of hierarchy exists in your culture? Is it something like in so the most important thing with hierarchy, to understand hierarchy, is what drives hierarchy. Okay, so is it like in old-timey Europe, back in the feudal days where people were literally born better? Is it like a caste system or a class system or something like that? Is it like the Gilded Age of America where wealth determined your hierarchy? The more wealthy you were, the longer your family had wealth, the higher you were in the pecking order. Is it magic in a fantasy world? Is it your ability to communicate with the gods? Is it your rank within a temple? Any of these can be hierarchy. Is it military? If you're in a military environment, that's a very hierarchical culture. Um, so what is your hierarchy?
Hmm.
And what drives the hierarchy? And if you have less of a hierarchy, how do people decide things? Like if there's a conflict, what is the conflict resolution mechanisms? Things like that. Speaking of conflict, your next one is legal, which is always a lovely and uncontentious problem to have. Like what laws your society has and should have, and how they, but
And also
also,
the reasons.
yeah, and how they're
So like,
enforced. Like, do they come from the Moors? Do they come from the past? Is it to regulate fantasy? How are fantastical elements regulated? How is magic regulated? All of those are very important questions to ask in the legal layer.
yeah, in one of our favorite series, it opens up, talking about Guardians of the Flame,
Mm,
it opens up where the characters wake up on this hill and they're looking down over the city and they're like, hey, we should go down. And the two majors are like, oh, we can't go in there. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, if we go in there, we'll die. Like, we'll literally burn to death as we pass the gates. And they're like, how would you know that? Like, we're not even from this world. And it's like, there's letters on the wall. It says it. And they're like, we can't see that. And I was like, oh, so we learned that only mages can see magical writing and that there's the ability to ward entire cities. And obviously that means that mages are very dangerous and very, you know, looked upon in certain ways between certain societies. So, we have right there, you have the hierarchy, you have symbolism, you have the norms, all of those things played into what we just did in that one little thing, but it makes it so memorable and it makes it so real feeling. Like, oh yeah, if you had these guys that could throw lightning bolts and fireballs, and you're just some country town that, you know, doesn't really have a way to protect yourself from those type of people, they just come in and run amok. The city guards couldn't do anything to them. Like, maybe you would want to have some barriers up there that would not allow them even into the city.
yeah.
So love stuff like that.
And it is a very important question. How does your society regulate magic? And what happens if a magic user, like a mage, is caught breaking the law? Because can you imprison them? Is it possible? What if they can teleport? Like,
Yeah.
how do you prevent them? So you need to think about these things so that you can bring them into play or not, and so on.
Yeah. In a superhero world, they both do it well sometimes and they do it half-assed sometimes.
Yeah.
So like, I love what they try to do with Magneto, with an entire plexiglass building and a plexiglass everything, and the guards have no metal on them and all this other stuff. But then later, we start learning that actually there's iron in our blood and Magneto can even affect that. So even the guard couldn't be there. So yeah, it's just these are things to think about. If you've got all
Yeah,
these powers, how does the rest of society protect themselves from those that have those powers that go wrong?
absolutely. And then the last layer of the cultural model is expression, which is basically things like dancing, music, What is your culture's how do they express their cultural values when they're in their entertainment, in their paintings, in their artwork, what is favored art forms for your culture, and so on.
Games and
Yeah,
contests and all of that. And I've
all of
read
that.
so many fantasy books that there's none of that, you know.
That's so weird to me every time I read it. I'm
Yeah.
like, does nobody, board games and dice games have been with us since like hunter-gatherer days.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
really? Nobody's carved a set of dice and figured out how to play a dice game? Like, come now.
Or a tile game
Yeah,
or all of that stuff. So
yeah,
yeah, it's so weird that they don't bring that stuff in.
yeah,
And again, all of these things, everything we're going through are all to make your story feel more real. How deep you go into them, that's up to you. If you're like Marie and really enjoy world building, then go as deep. I mean, if you're having fun with it, go as deep as you want. If you're like me, I kind of think about, okay, what do I really need for my story? And I try to preload that. And then I know that I'm going to hit things that I may create as I write to flesh that out and then keep it consistent.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if you guys are wondering what the green and red lines are, um, the book will be out. You need to buy the book, or I think you said something about they can download something.
They can download this document, but I'll tell you quickly what the green and red lines are. So the green lines are basically subcultures, right? So they're identities. And the reason why they're lines is because if identities are affected, if something happens that changes your identities, right, that deeply affects identities, your whole culture trembles because of the shocks, because it affects your culture from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The red lines are the material conditions of your culture, right? And that is things like your fantasy level, your magic level, your economics of your culture, your geography of your culture, your food, your shelter, all of that is your material conditions. And again, it affects every layer of your culture because it has impact on every layer. And if it changes, like if you have a massive magical earthquake that rips your little village apart, your whole culture is affected by it.
So the Stormlight Chronicles from Sanderson's a great example of that. So
Yeah,
for the first couple of books, you're this weird architecture. The buildings have these massive domes on, I can't remember if it's the east or west side, but on
yeah,
one side of the building, and then the door is always on, the opposite side, and they're all protected. And then you find out it's because about every couple of weeks, this like Cat 7 hurricane is just constantly circling the globe. And so everything is set up that way. And you can't go out in the storm during that time, you'll die. So, commerce stops, life stops, society stops during the storm, the couple days of the storm and all this other stuff. And then I think it's in the second book, something happens and the storm reverses course. So now you have every single society on this planet that has built their city walls, their house walls, their barn walls, their every structure ever built is built to protect on one side only. So the devastation that is caused and the death and the destruction and everything else, that is a
and
massive change. And it changes literally everything on this list.
exactly. Because it shakes up the whole culture. Stormlight's also a great example of identities changing, right? Because at the start
Mhm.
of the book, the light eyes are the nobles.
Mhm.
Okay. If you're born with light eyes, you're considered a noble and so on, because the whole like thing of the light eyes is it's people who can use magic. But
Mhm.
then that guy from Bridge Crew 4, whose name escapes me right now, learns magic and his eyes turn light. And he's a commoner. I think he's even a slave, right? And
Yeah.
so that now becomes a new identity, right? People who've learned to use Stormlight and their eyes lighten. And this fundamentally impacts the identities in your world and the hierarchy of your world. Is hella complex there all of a
Yeah.
sudden.
And it's been a while since I read it, but I think that the nobles knew that and they just suppressed the information because they didn't want just any commoner joining them
Right.
on their side of the
Right.
fence. Because that's the thing, it's another thing with all of this when we're talking about this. One thing we haven't mentioned is how do you protect that? The people that are in
Mm.
power want to stay in power.
Yeah.
So there are the laws, the symbolisms, all these different things we talked about are all there and create disparagement. They create power and weakness and all this other stuff. That's what societies do. It's just, we would all love to live in a utopian world where everybody got along and everybody was equal and everything was the same, but that's just not, it's never happened yet.
Yeah.
Not saying we shouldn't keep trying to get there, but
Yeah.
it is something that when you just look at the world, it just isn't there. And so, and also we're writing fiction. And in fiction, we need conflict. We need that disparagement because that's where we're going to tell our story from to kind of showcase something in our own world. And so you don't want to create this, crazy. You can't, I don't think you could write a story if the world was a perfect utopian.
Not unless it's not actually a utopia and there's like an underlying
Right. And
discovery.
everyone who's done
But
that,
you can't, you have to have conflict.
yeah,
No conflict,
no
no
story.
conflict, no story.
Yeah.
So those are my kind of material conditions. It's those red lines, and then the green lines are my identities, and that's my model for cultural world building. That is what I
Yeah.
believe you should follow as a world builder.
And it's
Again,
very
like
organized and it's
yeah,
very organized and it's very logical and it gives you a process to follow. But
yeah,
remember, it's still you. It's still you thinking about things and deciding because the model is not going to show you how this layer connects to that layer, connects to that layer on this item that you've created. And so you're going to have to think through those things.
exactly. But I also want to emphasize something else. And, despite the fact that, I mean, I do enjoy world building and all the rest of that, but I do also not advise building this model out for every single culture you've got.
Mhm.
Okay. You're never going to get to actually writing your story.
Right.
Build your main cultures out like this, then maybe add like a couple, like, no, the core of the other cultures that people encounter.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing that I teach when I'm teaching world building is and even plotting and everything like that. One of the things that you should build in as a writer is the understanding that you just don't know everything.
Yeah.
And so, and you need to be comfortable with that. You need to be comfortable with no matter how much work you do ahead of the game, it's not going to be enough. So the rule that I like to follow is I've written it, it's canon. I can't change that unless I can figure out a way to change it that there was enough breadcrumbs that the reader is like, oh, yeah, no, it was kind of that makes sense that the character believed this and it was presented to us as fact, like we just talked about the utopian world. So, Logan's Run is always my go-to for that. So he believes that he lives in a perfect world. He believes that, it's great to have everything provided to you. He believes that you're a selfish, POS if you don't kill yourself when you turn 35 because now you're old and you're worthless and you're taking resources away from younger people. So how dare you not kill yourself? And so, he believes that this is the perfect world. And then he learns differently.
Yeah.
So, and you don't feel like, oh wow, you lied to me with your utopian society. You set up canon and you broke your own canon. You're a terrible writer. No, we knew that there was this. We didn't know what it was, but we know there can't be a story if we live in this perfect utopian world. So you can change these.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I always like I say to people is it is more important to understand the underlying forces of your world so that you can start writing than it is to define every last cultural tidbit, every last festival, etc., etc. Because if you understand the forces that move your culture, you will understand how to invent things that fit with your culture. And as long as all the vibes head in the same way, you're golden. It'll
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a writer's conference, met somebody writing, that are there because they're writing a fantasy novel, and I'm like, you know, so, what is your novel about? What are you writing? Well, I haven't started my novel yet. I'm still world building. I was like, oh, well, how long you been working on that? 17 years. Like, well, then you're not writing a novel. Like, that's not that's you're writing a role playing setting because that's the level of detail that you need for a role-playing setting, but you're not writing a novel. You don't need that stuff for a novel. It's too much. And even now we always create, I mean, my wikis for, my fantasy worlds are way bigger than what you'll ever get out of the actual story. Because again, we're geeks. It's fun. Sometimes it's fun just to go down this rabbit hole and create all this stuff. And I'm not saying it doesn't get used, because it definitely influences. Even if it's not in the story, something that I created might influence a decision that I make for something in the story. And then it seems all consistent, and it seems like it has history, and it seems like it has all this other stuff. So I don't think I have ever, or anybody will ever, waste time world building, creating this stuff and anything like that for your story. It's just that at some point you really need to be thinking, if you're going to write novels, you need to be thinking, okay, what do I need for the novel?
At some
And
point,
then
you have to
create
put
those.
pen to paper and you have to actually write the story.
Yeah.
You cannot get trapped in an endless world building cycle. Like, that is not the way to finishing a novel.
Yeah.
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 So much as I'm proud of this model and all the rest of it, and there are inside of the document, there are links to like videos on my channel, that provide specific guidance on those elements, all the rest of that. Don't get trapped in world building eternally. And don't trap yourself in trying to build this model for every single culture on your planet.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts on cultures?
I think we covered it all. I think if you like, one of the nice things about your system that I like, and that's why I started off with, I'm a brand new writer, is so much. It gives you oh, okay, well, in this one, I just got to pick these 4 things.
Yeah.
And then use that to help me pick these couple other things. And then use those to help me pick these other, so the thing I love about your system is it does start in this very small way, and it allows me to build out from there and add complexities and not feel overwhelmed by it.
And that is my goal also with the book, is to help you to iteratively build your world. Start small, start with what you really need, expand in a way that's logical and makes sense and works with you while you're writing your story.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And we talk about that all the time.
Yep.
Scene set organically, world build organically, give the reader what they need when they need it. They do not need 3 chapters of your world's history before your story starts. They just don't want it. They don't need it. They're going to pass on it. They're going to go somewhere else. There is a subgenre of people who like that, 100%. But it's you're not going to make a living off of that small little subgenre unless you somehow capture 100% of it.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that's feasible these days.
And I think that is a good note on which to end this episode. We will see you soon for another one.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. This is Marie Mullaney, your co-host on this literary adventure. Our goal is to provide you with valuable insights and discussions on writing. If you believe in our mission, please like and subscribe our podcast. Sharing our episodes with your community not only helps us grow, but also contributes to a richer, more diverse conversation about storytelling. We appreciate your support. For a deeper understanding of the topics we've discussed, head over to Just in Time Worlds on YouTube. It is a treasure trove where fantasy meets history and science. Every Tuesday, you'll find new videos that delve into the intricacies of world building, drawing from our rich real-world history. Whether you're a writer, a role player, or just a fantasy enthusiast, Just in Time Worlds offers unique insights that will enrich your perspective. Check it out and join the journey of crafting incredible worlds.
If you are ready to take your writing to the next level and work with a group of highly motivated, dedicated writers who are all working to not only improve their writing, but improve your writing, plus you get to work with me on a weekly basis, then I'll encourage you to check out writersroom.us. This is a website that I have created that I really wish I had 30 years ago. It's everything a writer needs to become a better writer. Not only do we do weekly critique sessions, both from other members as well as me, we have daily writing sessions, I do monthly classes, Q&As, we have activities, I do all sorts of learning exercises, such as I do a quarterly writing prompt contest, and just tons and tons and tons of things. So if you're ready to get serious about your writing and you want to actually finish that novel and have a chance of it being published, then I encourage you to head on over to the writer's room and join me there. And as a special promotion for listeners of Releasing Your Inner Dragon, I'll go one step more. If you would like to get 50% off for 3 months, reach out to me. There's a million ways you can do that. You can do it through starvingwriterstudio.com, drakeu.com, any of my social medias such as LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X, whatever. Reach out to me, say that you would like to check out the Writer's Room for 50% off, and I will send you a link that will allow you to do just that. So hopefully you're ready to start getting serious about writing, and I'll see you in the Writer's Room.